Well, hi there. Scott here, founder and chief strategist at Innate Strategies, creator of Emergent Impact. I want to give you guys a sense of what a simple project looks like. And this is a relatively simple project. It's still a complex project because that's the point of Emergent Impact, is to be able to solve complex problems. But relative to some, it's a fairly simple project. I'm not going to read this out to you. I just want to give you a sense of different places it's been applied. This is by no means all of our clients, but this is gives you some sense of it, and also some sense of the numbers. I haven't updated these in a while, but it gives you a sense that it's been pretty well tested. It's been surprisingly successful over the past 20 years, or 22 years, I guess now. I want to talk about this in three simple steps first. There are a multitude of steps, but at the highest level, there are three things we do. We create an individual map. We take all of those individual maps from a 360-degree set of stakeholders, and we integrate those into one integrated map of the whole ecosystem that would satisfy all of the stakeholder groups. And then we analyze that and pull out of that the levers, and those levers themselves, rather than being a list, are in relationship with one another such that they create the strategy map, the sequencing and pacing of the different things we have to go do in order to shift the whole system in the direction all of the stakeholders want it to go to satisfy the needs of the stakeholders as a whole. All right, so this project was with a quarter of a billion acres of forest in the southern U.S. divided among 80,000 landowners. So it's a sufficiently complex problem. However, it's not as complex as some that we could show. So you'll see what I mean as we get into it, and you'll see what we mean because I'm going to contrast it with a more complex problem. This is an individual map. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. I just want you to get a sense of what one looks like. What I want you to understand is this is one of those 360-degree stakeholders that we put a goal at the top. You can read that for yourself. We prefer that they are measurable and time specific. In this case, the best we could do was long-term and 5 to 6%. We ask each individual to tell us what they're seeking to cause for whom or what or where, and what's required in order for that to come about. And can they tell us that based on their favorite success story? And so they do. And we're taking all these notes. We understand how to map, so we know what questions to ask, and then we create a map. So the goal goes at the top, and then directly below that are these 5 key resources required in order to achieve that goal. And then under those 5 key resources are all of the other elements that are required to cause each of those and then to cause the whole. So I'll give you a little bit of explanation here. First of all, was the need to realign environmentalist mindsets with reality. And by that, what we meant was, in the old days, yes, there was way too much clear cutting that went on. However, today, forests, in order to be profitable and have to be sustainably managed, they have to be thinned and selectively cut rather than clear cut. So that's a much different forest management process today than it was when those stark images of clear cuts were cemented in our brains. So understanding that they have to be managed is critical to rebranding renewable forest products so that the market will accept them. So we'll have social license to do that. Then we have to be able to identify the conservationist investment partners that are willing to take this 5 to 6% ROI. And then we have to go find the parcels of land that will help to generate that 5 to 6% ROI, whose landowners are willing to enter into deals. And then we have to craft those deals to make them work. And then we have to be able to generate that sustainable ROI over time. So those are all of the critical components required to do that. So that's an individual map. So imagine we have a whole bunch of those individual maps. Now we integrate them into a map of the whole. So this, at a glance, I know you can't read it, that's for on purpose. Right now I want you to see the whole thing. We integrate that into a map that represents the optimizing the interest for all the stakeholders in the system. So what does it look like? Well, at the heart of it here in the center is the fundamental goal set. And it's a goal set because in this case, and this is what's so lovely about working in this way, their presenting goal was this, quarter of a billion acres maintained. There's a question mark here by 2030 because originally they'd said 2060, but as they learned more about the system and as we learned more about the system, I began to question whether 2060 was sufficient or not. And some of the interviews pointed to questioning that as well. So, but if that is their goal, then what they've got to do is, by the way, this is what's called a stock flow diagram. Imagine this is like a bathtub, and this is the inflow from the faucet, and this is the outflow from the drain. So as it gets converted, some part of this gets converted into solar farms or cattle farms or something else, then that maintaining that acreage goes down. It drains it out. But if we're maintaining it, then we're building that up. Okay, well, the question that had never been asked is, if you want to maintain it, what are the economic needs of the forest landowners? That's what this FLO is, and forest land investors. What are the economic needs of those individuals if they're going to be able to maintain this land so that it does not get converted to higher ROI conversion opportunities? By the way, these different colors you see refer to different colors in different parts of the map. We do it that way so that we don't have to draw lines all over the map and make a mess out of it. Okay, so the beautiful thing about this was, and by the way, this wasn't something that was ever really proposed directly by the people I interviewed or the organization I was doing the work for, which included the U.S. Forest Service and Keeping Forests and some other key funders. They simply wanted to maintain this land. However, when you think about it, well, the idea of renewable forest products, which is why we were doing this map, is that it will be able to fund the maintenance of these lands. Well, that requires that you know what the economic needs are. Because if you don't know what the economic needs are, how can you determine whether or not you're going to be able to meet those needs such that people will maintain them? And that's what this meeting those needs means they will maintain them. All right, well, if we want to meet those needs, well, then we have to know what those needs are, which had never been asked before. And then secondly, we have to know what the economic value is of those forests if they were to be converted into renewable forest products in order to be able to meet the economic needs of those owners so that they would maintain it in forest. Well, this value of the forest had never been asked before either. So right here in the very beginning, without going any further, were three critical questions that need to be answered by the group if they're going to be able to achieve their goal of maintaining that 250 million acres by 2030 or 2060. So it was immediately valuable to do it this way. But then we went further. So now we're going to say, okay, if this is what we have to accomplish, these three things in order to achieve that major goal, then that's a function of what's the potential economic demand for those forest products, whether it's energy, whether it's pulp and paper, whether it's recreational use, whether it's ecological services, whatever it might be. What is that economic demand? And then how is the brand of renewable forest products perceived? This goes back to that question about helping environmentalists understand the reality of needing to manage those forests. So how do we elevate the brand so that renewable forest products can beat out plastics or can beat out concrete and steel if we're talking about mass timber buildings, building buildings out of these mass timbers that are put together through laminated wood that comes out of these renewable forests. So how do we build the brand? Once we build the brand and now we've got all this demand, can we meet that demand and the expectations of what those products will provide? If we can meet demand, then can we actually sell that? So the meeting demand was, do we have the capability to meet demand? But then we've got to be able to sell it, and can we sell it relative to the competition? If we can sell it, then can we generate a competitive return on investment, even if we have sold it? Because we're going to sell it at a sales price that's competitive. Can we generate the return on investment we need from that relative to the competition? And then if we can do all that, can we use all that to then manage healthy working forests? So those were the six big elements required in order to satisfy this sort of central chain of goals here in the center. All right, so we went through this whole map with everybody. We worked it until everybody agreed, yes, this is our whole world, all of its bits and pieces, the relationship of those bits and pieces. We understand why we're experiencing what we're experiencing today. We can see how we could experience what we want in the future. And I see the thing that I care about in here. Okay, great. So we got a map that satisfies the whole group of these diverse 360 stakeholders. All right, great. Now what? So what? Well, now we have to distill out of that the levers. So here's what the levers look like. So it reduces that whole big map to this little map, and it does so by pulling out the key resources in that big map that will enable us to move the whole system. And that's done through an analysis, and I'll show you something about that in a moment. But here we're still calling it 2060 until they make the formal decision to go to 2030. But what you discover here, and you're seeing that a bunch of this is orange because it turns out that branding is a huge piece of this. They've got to be able to brand this stuff to be able to get it to move. So at the heart of being able to brand this is understanding who your key audience is that you're trying to speak to. That's important because you want to speak to an audience that the decision makers, the key decision makers care about. And you want to be able to generate a message that not only speaks for the audience, but speaks to the key decision makers and also speaks to the anchor brands. Anchor brands are things like Amazon and Target and Walmart and Sam's Club and so forth. Now, that means you're going to have to build a certain kind of a brand with that messaging that also appeals to the decision makers and also appeals to the anchor brands, such that you can use all of that to begin to align the forest landowners and the forest land investors toward a certain strategy. And you need that strategy because you've got to build up. This is on this blue, by the way, comes from the can you meet that demand part of the big map. You've got to build up the multidisciplinary academics, professionals, investors, and government capabilities to be able to meet that demand. And the reason that's important is if we talk about the academics in colleges and universities right now in the engineering schools, there is a lot taught about concrete and steel, but there is nothing taught about mass timber. And mass timber is the wave of the future because concrete and steel are heavy GHG producers, whereas mass timber is a GHG sequestering methodology. And we need all of this to get us, by the way, the labor we need to be able to go in and do that work, whether it's in the forests or in the factories or in the assembly, in the construction. If we can get all this going, then what we get is a high level of commitment to sustainability, which comes from all of those, the audiences and the target audiences, the decision makers and the anchors in the commercial space. That commitment to sustainability gets us the social license we need to be able to generate renewable forest products and to be able to change the policy and regulation in ways that favor renewable forest products. And with all of that, then we're going to be able to up the quality and quantity of pulp and paper demand. And that was singled out from all of the different kinds of resources available, products available, because it's the most readily available and it's the one you most need to manage if you're going to manage those forests. Because if that small timber gets out of control, that's when you get into that forest fire danger. And that creates this little systems map. And then what the client began to do then is to work on strategies for where they want to focus inside of here to move this whole little system itself forward. So that's those three maps: individual, integrated, and strategy. All right, now there were some intervening steps here. How did you get to that strategy map, for example? So let me show you a bit about that. All right, this is what we do to build relationship among the different members in the project, and also to build relationship with reality itself. There's a lot of different perspectives about how reality works. A lot of that is opinion-based, or a lot of that is based on isolated anecdotes or whatever. So we need a fact versus an opinion-based conversation. So this behavior of a time graph, what we're looking for is what's the behavior of a goal over time. And so here's the past, and here's today, and here's the future. And this is how that goal has behaved over time. I won't go into a lot of detail about this. I simply want to say they collectively come up with a goal. They talk about what success looks like on a scale of 1 to 10, and what failure looks like on a scale of 1 to 10, which is nobody has any incentive to keep their land and forest. And then we say, how far back do we need to go in order to understand the systemic forces that are pushing and pulling on our goal? And they decide how far back to go. They decide where it was back then. They decide why it was back there. So whenever anybody wants to change the inflection point in this graph, I ask them, what has you say that? Because again, we want a fact versus an opinion-based conversation. So they chart this, and then they get down to today, and then they say, and then we ask the question, well, this is a system. You're a part of the system. You've been hiring smarter and smarter people, raising more and more money, doing better and better projects, yet it's still going down like this. It's still declining. What's it likely to do going forward if nothing significant changes? And they have to agree. Eventually it goes like this. And for some markets, it goes even worse. Okay, then the question is, what must it do in order to, if this goal is to have any chance of surviving and thriving? And that's where they get from 2060 to 2030 is when they realize that given the rate of change that's at play in the marketplace right now, the opportunity for other higher ROI conversions of forest land, they've got to get on this really quickly. So that's where they got to the 2030 here. Now, so this creates gaps between where it's going to go for most and where it's going to go for other markets. And we really want to capitalize on that because the energy in the room is really high at that moment. People are in tighter relationship with one another. They're in tighter relationship with themselves because they realize they have allies around a goal they all care about. And they're in tighter relationship with reality. And all of that just creates this energy boost that we then want to capture in these different, just give us one word that describes the state of being we need to inhabit in order to close those gaps that you saw in that graph above. You know, we need unity, we need to be adaptable, we need to be nimble, we need a sense of urgency. Those kinds of words came out. So we keep these to remind ourselves as we get farther into the project about, you know, the kind of state of being we need to inhabit in order to solve this problem, because this is not easy work. It's easier work, but it's not easy work. Okay, so from that state of being, we have them interrogate the map. We have them go through the map. This one I showed you earlier. Because you really want them to attack this map, we need to know that it's right before we go into an analysis, or as close as we can get. Then we go into analysis. Now, this is just the summary sheet of a series of analyses they go through. We went through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different analyses here. So what we do is we run these different analyses. I won't tell you what they all are, but some are expert and some are systemic. That is, some of them I can do because I understand how systems are, or you'll be able to do because you understand how systems work if you decide to work in this way. But some of them the experts need to do because I don't know the specifics of demand for products or target audiences or those things. So we run them through these different. So imagine you're picking up the system and you're looking at it this way and this way and this way and this way, and that's what each of those analyses are. So then we simply do a count function. So this, in this case, this lever showed up in 6 out of 6 different analyses that we did. And then this one showed up in 5, and then this in 4, and then 3, and then 2. And then we cut it off at a certain point because we're trying to constrain the work we have to do. And typically in any system, it's about 15% of the variables that have high influence on the system. That means they can move a lot, and they have low exposure. That means is they're not impacted by a bunch of the systems. So think of it this way. We want something that pushes on a whole lot of stuff downstream, but has very little upstream impacting it, so that we only have to change a couple of things to change a bunch of things. So we get this list, and then we take that list. Now, this has been an individual conversation. That is, everybody filled out an individual worksheet to get to this, but they haven't had a collective conversation about what they think the levers are. We do the individual worksheets so that people with too much power or too much money or too much political influence, or they're just too loud, or there's some cases they're just too mean, don't dominate the conversation. So people fill out a worksheet. Then we reflect this back to the whole group without identifying who said what. Now they can have a conversation about, well, how come someone thought this was more important than I thought this other thing was? And that conversation happens, and we're able to then begin to form and start to move toward consensus as a group about what we think collectively are the important things. So then we do a collective analysis. By the way, that was just zooming in on that 6th thing. We do a collective analysis, and you'll start to notice how things start to converge. We start to see, like, this is getting, close to 1,200. This is getting, more around 1,000, 7, 3, 2. So you begin to see convergence, which is indicative of the fact that they're moving toward consensus. And so they're beginning to align around what they think the levers are. And so in this case, it was this ability to identify and influence decision makers. Now you'll see here that 9 people picked it as a lever there. Whereas if I go back up here, let me back up a second. Before, only 3 of that group had picked it as a lever initially. So the conversation definitely shifted points of view around what the levers are. Okay, now once we've got those, now we take that list, and that's where this strategy map came from. Okay, all right. Now I'm going to show you a more complicated project, not at the same level of detail. I'm just going to kind of flash through it quickly. But this was Sonoma County after the fires, those horrible, horrible fires of 2017 that at that point in time were the worst wildfires ever in California. 24 people lost their lives. There was about $8 billion in damage, $7,000 in 7,000 buildings lost, and about 110,000 acres lost. Massive problem. So what they wanted to do was to achieve a certain percentage and proportional diversity. And what that means is we wanted diversity of Sonomans that were living an inclusive, thriving, and resilient quality of life by 2025. That is that whatever the proportions of the different ethnicities were, that they were in that inclusive, thriving, resilient quality of life by 2025. And we were going to measure that by scoring 90 on what's called the Social Progress Index by 2028. And this percentage that they wanted to achieve, that was something to be determined in a separate conversation. This is an individual map that I did. This individual map is almost as complex as the simple map I showed you before. This was the fellow that ran the association, the Builders Association in town, or in the county, I'm sorry, or in the area. What was really valuable about his individual map, and you'll find this with each of these individual maps that you do, is that people see their world in a whole new way. And suddenly we were able to explain by interviewing him in the way that we do, and then modeling him, we were able to understand why houses weren't getting rebuilt as fast as people in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area had promised they would come in and help rebuild after those fires. And that was an authentic promise. It was a genuine promise. However, the problem is the fires didn't present the same rebuilding opportunity that the builders experienced in the East Bay. So in the business model of those builders was buildings are close to each other, therefore they can operate at scale, therefore they can create a high degree of profitability. And they can do that because the buildings are close together, the workforce is close together. So if there's a plumber working on one building and they discover a problem in a house, 4 doors down, the plumber can just walk over there and or drive their truck over there and fix it and come back and continue working. Well, and that's because all the sites are close to each other. Well, that's not true in this. Houses burned in all sorts of different locations. Large swaths of houses didn't burn. So it would take 20, 30, 45 minutes to get from one place to another. So you didn't have that scale opportunity. In terms of site uniformity and suitability, in the East Bay, you typically had either rolling hills or flat sites, but they were fairly uniform. And so you could build a lot of buildings in one place. Well, again, these happened on hillsides, in flat areas, in forested areas, in grasslands. They were radically different sites. So you couldn't get those economies of density that you could normally get. So that went that scalability issue. And then all of that impacted unit cost. It would normally bring the scalability would usually bring unit costs down, and which would allows the cost per unit to go down and still make a profit and all that. So anyway, it explained for this fellow how it was and why it was that the houses weren't getting rebuilt. And it gave him the ability to explain to others why it wasn't happening, which was really important because the citizens of the county were like, hey, what happened? How come we're not getting the houses rebuilt? Okay, this happened we did about 35 of these things, individual maps. Then we integrated them. Now, this is what I mean by a more complex map. You can see this is probably one of the more complex maps I've done. By the way, I'm not happy that it's complex. I'd rather it be simpler. It's better for all of us. However, in order to satisfy basically the life needs of a whole county, well, you'll see why it had to be so many pieces. So here's that goal at the middle, a certain percentage, with a thriving quality of life by 2025. Well, the components required for that are: one, what's the quality and quantity of social progress index decision and its decision design, making, and enforcement? Because they were having critical community-wide meetings at times that significant portions of the population couldn't attend because they worked or they couldn't get childcare or they didn't have transportation, whatever. So they had to design the meetings, they had to make those decisions, and then they had to enforce the decisions. There were a lot of decisions being made, but they weren't being enforced. So how does that get fixed? And then once the decision is made to do something, then how do we, innovate to ensure inclusion and resilience and thriving and sustainability? How does that innovation get done? Okay, now the number one need was affordable housing. So how does that get built? Because until you have an affordable house, there is no way for you to be safe and secure. You're subject to crime, you're subject to natural disasters, you're subject to all sorts of things. The elements, weather, rainstorms, cold. Once you're safe, now we can talk about healthcare and what that looks like. Once you're housed and safe and healthy, now we can talk about making a thriving wage. Now, what was interesting about this thriving wage, by the way, this also included both the educational side and the wage side. Now, what was interesting, because we came at this from the point of view of how do we enable a thriving wage, which is this surviving and thriving and inclusion and resilience and all that, it ended up that without any conscious intent, the map showed that the role of business was to ensure a thriving wage for its citizenry. We usually turn that around and say the role of the citizenry is to provide labor for the business. Well, this was flipping it around, saying the business has a responsibility to the community, not that the community has a responsibility necessarily to the business. The community does have responsibilities, but it was interesting that it flipped this to say, we're looking for thriving wages for our citizenry. Now, in order for that to happen and for education to happen and health and all that to happen, we had to have mobility, which included not only like transportation, but included, things like internet access and telecommuting and online goods and services. Then, of course, we had to have discretionary time. You can't work all the time. That's not healthy. So we've got to have, the percentage of the population having that. And then, of course, everybody needed to be able to create wealth. Everybody wanted to be able to own a home, send their kids to college, have a retirement fund, those kinds of things. So those were the elements required, and that's why this map ended up being so complex. So then we did an analysis of the map. And what was fascinating about this analysis is that something popped up that we never would have imagined would have popped up. So this is what that set looked like. It's a little more complex, but still not significantly more complex than the other map I showed you. It ended up using, distilling out of it. This represents only 6% of the variables from the other map, which is a pretty good reduction of places to go work. Now, what's fascinating is, while yes, this decision-making section was really critical, as was other sections. The number one variable in the whole system was the quality, quantity, and inclusiveness of childcare. Now that seems a little surprising until you stop and think about it. But once you think about it for a moment, you're like, oh my God, if there's childcare, I can go to work or I can go to school. If there's good childcare, especially in those early developmental years, education goes better and healthcare goes better for those children, so they don't end up in social services. They don't end up either because they can't get employment in the prison systems or in welfare systems. They don't end up. They end up smarter. They get along better in society. There's a whole set of things that happen when the quality, the quantity, and the inclusion of the child care is done well. So that's that strategy map. Okay, so now we've got a strategy map. Well, sort of so what, now what? Well, we've got to be able to then implement and execute, and we've got to be able to do this in an emergent way, and we've got to be able to do it at scale and at speed. So I've looked at several systems, about 5 of them. We talk about them in the training, but one that I've landed on, the one I've trained in, both in the practitioner training and in the coaching training, is holacracy. And this is an old image they don't use anymore, but it's one of the things that really drew me to the system was this notion of swarming and the kinds of rule sets that a graphic artist developed to explain how birds flock like this. Now, I'm not saying that birds actually think this way, but the rules they came up with were separation, don't get so close that we bang wings; cohesion, don't get so far apart that we're not a flock; alignment, follow the 3 birds in your field of view; and avoidance, don't hit a rock or a tree or a building. And when he programmed these little elements with that, then they were able to flock on screen. Again, I'm not saying birds do this, but if that's possible for these birds and for how fish school and things like that, there must be such systems that enable humans to swarm or to accomplish these things in a coordinated fashion. And in fact, holacracy has figured that out. So the reason I show you this diagram is it very much parallels what you see in a map. There's a central core in the map. Then there are these different areas that, in my view, are different colored areas that represent the different key resources that are required. And then if you were to zoom in on one of these, for example, if you zoom in onto that consulting services, which is right here, then you see the different roles inside of that. And that's what's important here, is that we're talking about roles, they're not people-centric, they're role-centric. And each role, if we were to look at, this coaching domain and this holacracy coach, each one has a purpose. Each one has its clear accountabilities. We know who those individuals are. We know if they are in control of any particular domains. But it goes into that level of depth and that level of clarity and articulation. And so there's a lot of value around how to execute using information from holacracy and from other sources as well. So I hope that didn't take too horribly long. I hope you found it informative. If you've got any questions, concerns, any suggestions, feel free to reach out. In the meantime, I'm going to say goodbye for now, and thanks so much for your time and attention. Take care.